Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. In a new millennium, we find ourselves certainly packed with technology that brings the workforce to a particular place where there might not be as many opportunities in the days past, especially when it comes to places and positions such as management, middle management, and executive management. So what can we do so that we can stay ahead of that curve and find ourselves actually achieving the particular timely goals that set us into the direction where we want to be by the time is to get there? Well, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a nationally award-winning marketing professional who has more than a quarter of a century of experience leading corporate marketing and communications for several multi-million and billion-dollar companies. He started out with IBM, serving customers and partners in the United Kingdom, and decided to move to the U.S. following an assignment in New York, where he continued to work for IBM for 9 more years. And since leaving, he has held senior executive and CMO roles at both private and Fortune 500 companies, including Storage Tech, Sun Microsystems, AMD, and Stratus Technologies. His book has become a 21st century executive and how you can break away from the pack. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Nigel DeSalle. Nigel, thank you for joining us here on the program.
Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
How different is the landscape this day and age than, say, 30 years ago?
I think it's significantly different, and I think part of what drove much of the book and the website that's based on is the fact that the world that we live in today and the world that we're trying to succeed in looks fundamentally different for sort of 2 or 3, I think, really good reasons. I think technology is different. I think globalization is different. And the experiences of the next generation, the millennials, is completely different. So what it took to succeed then and what it takes to succeed now, I think, is very different.
Now, give us an idea what are some things that people this day and age are facing that perhaps wasn't there before.
I think the most obvious one is email. If you think about it, when I started working for IBM back in 86, we actually had email, but it was a very nascent, very early technology that actually required you to be permanently sitting in front of a machine if you wanted to use it, which, by the way, was pretty nice because when you weren't sitting in front of it, you couldn't do email. Today, it surrounds us. It's on our watches, on our phones, and on our laptops, and it's just everywhere. And there's a generation of users who have never grown up without knowing instant messaging and email and communications. So that's a very different way of working, but it's also created a different set of habits that aren't necessarily good or effective in the work environment. And you can think about all the technology we have and how that's affected the way people influence and work with each other.
Now, in your book, you describe how it's really important to have, I guess, call it a long-range goal, but then also being sure that you have a subset of goals that allows you to know that in a timely manner and in a measured way that you're actually coming to that point that you're actually looking toward. Tell us a little bit more about what that means.
So, this idea really very much came from a dinner I had with one of my own team members a number of years ago, and we were actually in New York for an event, and he said, I'd like to take you out for dinner, so that's fine. And we started the dinner with a conversation. He said, I don't think I'm where I thought I would be by now. I said, well, explain what that means. And he said, I've come to this point in my career. I may be halfway through working life, and I'm not as far ahead as I thought I would be. He was having what I call a sort of mid-career crisis, that he wasn't, as he looked back on the first 20 years of his career, as successful as he wanted to be. And it really forms the basis of when we talked about, well, what decisions did you make, what choices have you made, if you don't have a sense of where you're trying to get to, if you don't have some big picture plan, then you can't be surprised if you don't get there. And it's change your mind and it's adapt the plan. But using the old phrase from Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter what direction you take. And that's not good when it's your career.
Or another way to put it, too, is I really don't know where I'm going, but I'm certainly making good time.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an old English expression called muddling through, that people, when they don't know what they're doing, they just muddle through. And people who muddle through their career are leaving it to luck, and luck is not a strategy. And, it's okay if you leave it to luck. Maybe you'll be very successful. But I think if you're not, then it'll be your own fault for not taking control.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think what's really interesting, as you brought up earlier in the program about millennials, is that we seem to have a generation that has pretty much decided, I'll get where I want to go in my own time, even if they're working for someone else. And I think that's troubling sometimes for generations of past. You hear the claim of they don't seem to have the work ethic or the initiative or drive, hunger, whatever you want to call it, that we once used to. But yet they certainly bring a different set of skills and perhaps talents that, really weren't there as much back in our generation, again, because technology has a lot to do with driving what's occurring here in the workplace today.
Yeah, I think you really touched the balance point there for most people who are hiring millennials into the workplace. They like the millennials because they come connected, they become good at networking and using the technology and all those things. They like that. But they look at them and they go, they shake their heads sometimes. And I always say to them, the number one thing you have to remember when you're hiring across a generation, so I'm just beyond 50, so I'm a Gen X. So when you hire a baby boomer, or a baby boomer hires you, or when you're hiring a millennial, you've got to remember what motivates you may not be what motivates them. And so what motivates me as a Gen X probably isn't what motivates a millennial. So you've really got to understand that and what's important to them. Otherwise, you won't be able to position to them what you need them to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of valuable things that people can really know when it comes to your book, Becoming a 21st Century Executive. And I think one of the key things that you're talking about is how you need to try to avoid becoming middle management, so to speak, that it's certainly part of the journey, but it's not an area you want to be stuck in.
Yeah, I always think the middle management, to some extent, get a bit of a bad knock because, having lived in for a number of years in middle management, they have a difficult role in as much as, for many of them, they have to take direction from above that's really not always very clear and then translate it to the front line so real work can get done. And they have to take feedback from the front line, which may not be very complimentary, and send it back upwards in a way that really can help the people above them do something useful with it. And it's a very hard and pretty thankless job. So a bit of career planning, a bit of focus means you won't get stuck there forever.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think one of the most valuable things I was reading about was the difference between hunger and ambition. Describe that a little bit there, because I think this is going to be very important for people to understand, especially when you happen to be in a company that's fairly large. You tend to have a lot of office politics. You certainly see the people that tout and wave and blow their whistles, to say, this is where I want to be and I'm willing to do anything my boss needs me to do, and the hell with everybody else, so to speak, versus somebody who's hungry for that upward mobility, so to speak.
I think it's a really good thought, and it's interesting you picked up on that, because actually I think it may be the single most important dividing line between those who succeed and climb up the ladder and those who stall out at some point.
And Nigel, I completely agree with you, because I read this, and there were parts of me that cringed realizing, here are these people that I would consider to be mediocre, but they can't shut up and they can't get out of anybody's face. And it's like, why would you want to promote somebody like that?
Right, so let's deal with the difference. So ambition is the person who stands up and says, I want to get promoted. I want to be famous. I want.
Right.
And what's typically about those ambitious people is they say it. People with hunger don't say it, they do it. And I know the people with hunger on my team. And if I use a baseball analogy, it's the person who in the bottom of the ninth, with the game on the line, says, Coach, give me the bat. Let me take a swing. I might strike out, but let me try and do this. And I think that's the hunger that you want, and it's the hunger that's rewarded. And senior executives understand and they see the difference. And people might not believe it, but I know the people on my team who are demonstrating hunger, willing to take the bat, put themselves forward, even though they might fail, and those who just want to keep talking about how they need to be promoted.
I think that was one of the reasons that I found myself really avoiding being involved with offices and so forth, is because there was so much of that nonsense going on. It's like, why don't you quit focusing on yourself and focus on how we can become better as a team? And that's one thing that I'm big about. I love teams. And you actually shared an interesting story in there when it comes to teams about, sometimes there are those difficult calls where perhaps as a supervisor, team leader, that you need to put somebody else on the other team due to a project, and how you need to effectively communicate with that person, how important that is, should you feel any kind of resistance. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think one of the hardest things for people to do is to be transparent. And it's really one of the most powerful things you can do. And I've been involved in projects, I've been involved in situations where I knew that myself, something I was doing was reducing the effectiveness of the team or the situation. And I think when you find yourself in that situation, the right thing you can do for the business, for the organization that you're in, is go to your boss and say, I think we're limiting the effectiveness of this team or this structure if we do that. I remember I had a customer when I was an IBM sales rep, and the customer just didn't like me. And I find that, of course, very difficult to believe that anyone wouldn't like me. There was just something we just chemistry-wise did not work. So I went to my boss and I said, look, boss, this is an important account for us. This is an important customer. I think we're going to fail if you leave me on this account. We should make a swap. And, at the end of the day, they did that, and the account situation was fine. And at the end of the year, I was rewarded, because what my boss said to me was, there would have been nothing worse than you not saying that and us failing, and you allowed us to achieve. And I think when you are transparent about these things and when you're honest about these things, you act with that sort of integrity, the business works.
Here's an interesting thought, too. I love this particular part of the conversation. It reminds me of a time many, many years ago when I was involved in the hospitality industry as a food server. And, my attitude is I could handle quite a bit. And there was no doubt that not only the host staff, but the management staff knew that about me. I was one that would typically take more tables than others would. Not everybody, but others, because I was able to execute the duties, to be very detail-oriented, and to be sure that things came out right. But I also knew my limitations, too, and I knew how to communicate if I needed things. If I needed perhaps this person to slow down seating people, or could you go and get me this, or I need this. And people would generally jump when I would ask them to do that. But then there would be those who wouldn't do that, who would try to do it all, and what would happen, inevitably, obviously, was mistakes would get made, and then there would be a lot of customer complaints. And I think that's so important for people to understand. You don't need to think that you can do it all at the detriment of the fact that you think your boss is going to get upset with you because maybe you're not able to rise to that occasion. Let's face it, we all have limitations. And I think it's in the expression and, as you say, the honest transparency of letting people know, hey, I'm kind of limited at this point, I could use some help. You actually do yourself more of a service than a disservice, which is, I think, opposite from the thinking of people who are in that position in the first place.
I agree, and I think, the control freak is not going to be successful in the end in any size organization where you have to work with other people. There's an expression you often hear at work or in a work environment where when something's going badly, they say there are like 5-year-olds at a soccer match. Everybody's crowding around the ball. The successful way to work is a team where you play for position, where you have a position and you play it, and you can be trusted to play your position and you trust the other people to play theirs. So, you throw the ball to the second baseman, whether there's a second baseman there or not, because they'll be there by the time the ball is there. And I think playing for position and trusting other people to play theirs and helping them be successful, that's what makes an organization work. I think those who try and control everything eventually fail, and they only have one person to blame when they do that.
Well, the fact is they're the ones that are there.
Right, and they've got rid of all the other people who could help them, and I just think it's a very sad thing to watch a control freak fail. And what you find out is the people who struggle with that tend to go into individual contributor jobs. And even people like Steve Jobs, where you hear the sort of industry rumors, the man was a control freak, he wanted to do everything. You just know in reality that's not true, because he really couldn't do everything. Life's just not that simple. So you got to use the people around you.
Well, the truth, too, and having read about Steve Jobs, is that you could look at him as a control freak, but he was an excellence freak. And he wanted to put out there something nobody else out there had. And you hear from the people that worked under him, God, he was a real SOB to work with, but boy, am I sure glad he pushed me to levels I never even imagined. And that's true leadership.
Yeah, and I suspect, I never really knew him, so I suspect that he did that with a consistency and an honest and an open and a rewarding fashion. And those people who, wanted that environment. And I think it also opens up a really interesting conversation for people. If you find yourself in a organization or in a place where you can't be successful, you can't be transparent, and you can't achieve through the things you and I are talking about, then you've really got to ask yourself, is that the right place to be? And if not, you have to take some real decisions. Now,
I know there are two key elements that you talk about in your book on Become a 21st Century Executive that I think are so important in this conversation, especially for our listeners, is initiative and problem solving. And I think those two things sometimes in the workplace almost at times seem non-existent. A, there's a problem. B, everybody's waiting for somebody else to go solve it. And it reminds me, I think it was back in 1979, there was this news story that showed, it was up somewhere right around the upper Midwestern part of the United States, where a woman had somehow ended up in this freezing small pond. And what was amazing about this is that the news cameras all showed up as this woman's in the middle flailing for her life in this pond that's basically at 0 degrees. And it's only a matter of time before hypothermia sets in. Even more alarming was the amount of people standing around the edge of this pond waiting for somebody else to do something about it. And although the helicopter was dropping a lifeline, she was losing energy to be able to reach up and grab this thing. Then all at once, this person just jumps into the lake, swims out to her, grabs a hold of the lifeline, and she was pulled to safety. Initiative. There was a problem, somebody took initiative. And it's funny how people will actually stand back and wait for somebody else to do something about it. And in your experience, why do you think that is?
Well, and nowadays, of course, they stand back and film it when it's going on, which is, even more worrying. I think, this funny old line I've used with teams before, which is, don't tell me if you wanted me to use my initiative, you should have told me.
Right.
And at the end of the day, I think it's modeling good behavior. I think what people need to see is they need to see you as a leader, both problem solve, getting to the root cause, and not, simply going off with the symptoms. So watch you root cause and then put the resources in the place to solve it. And I think in large, very bureaucratic organizations, both of those things have not got enough value. So people who do real root cause analysis and to do the problem solving and then think through how to solve that and have the initiative to do it. If they don't get the credit, if that's not rewarded in your organization, then it's a behavior that will not be repeated. And if you have that ability to problem solve, and if you are someone who uses your initiative and you are not rewarded for it, you'll either stop doing it or you'll go somewhere where they'll reward you for that.
Certainly understood. And I think another thing, too, is the feeling that if I step in and try to solve this problem and make it worse, boy, that can be costly to me, and that I'd rather just not do it in the first place. In other words, being caught making a mistake.
Well, there are two things about making mistakes. I think first of all, the quicker you own up to the mistake, the least damage it does. So if you make a mistake, say something this next second, and the chances are it'll be fixed. The longer you leave it, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. I think that's the first thing about mistakes. But the second thing is, again, a culture can be built up. Companies have personalities, like people have personalities. If you're in a company or an organization where the personality is one of secrecy and keeping to yourself and not being transparent, then again, as an organization or the leader of that organization, you're encouraging exactly the wrong behavior.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know there's an element that is so rare in the workplace. Imagine that you finally get that job and you're working for a company, and there's always this attitude, well, you're the new guy. It's sort of like Vietnam. Well, you're new, so you're not worth, or your value isn't as much as the rest of us, so we're going to put you out there on point. And if you die, well, better now than later on, something like that. But I remember a good friend of mine. He was really excellent when it came to new people coming into the workplace about how welcomed and at home he made these people feel. And not only that, but would also nurture them so they can get a feel, sort of the lay of the land about the culture of the place, things like that. And this was someone who rose not only prominently, but he got to a point where he outgrew a company to the point he decided to go ahead and start his own company. Why not? It seemed like an obvious next step. But, there's a lot to be said about becoming sort of that mentor coach and actually taking the initiative again to be something like that.
Yeah, and I suspect somewhere in his past somebody did it for him. Mm-hmm. And I think what he was doing, which I think is just fabulous, is being both sometimes mentor, sometimes coach. And I think that they're actually slightly different roles. But there is nothing more fulfilling to me in a work environment than investing your time and energy to help somebody, whether they're new or someone within your team, achieve the most they can achieve. And not only is it a good thing for you and a great thing for them, you will build lifelong friends and relationships and connections out of that. And that's people don't forget that. People remember those who did that for them. Mm-hmm. And it's a very long life. We always say that your career is a marathon, not a sprint. You never know when you'll meet those people again. And behavior, good or bad, can come back and bite you or reward you.
Mm-hmm. And it sure is a good feeling, too, if you're out in the public, which from time to time I would be with him, and these people would come out of the blue. Hi, Frank, how are you doing? It's been a long time, and it seemed like everywhere we went, somebody was coming from somewhere to come up and say hello to this guy. And I thought, what's going on? Oh, this was somebody I worked with, and he was managing shipping and having a rough time, and da-da-da-da-da, and then this is what happened. And I was like, that's pretty incredible to see people come out of their way to just come and say hello to you, and see how you're doing, as you were describing there. And that's really important, especially as you talk about creating a network. Certainly you want that network to be strong. Well, part of it is your behavior and how you were with these people in the first place.
Yeah, and that may be the secret of networking. The old Beatles line, the love you take is equal to the love you make. I think that's pretty true of networking as well, that networks are something that you need to invest in, you need to look after, you need to manage, you need to curate, and if you do that, they will look after you. And I remember I was in a having breakfast in a hotel in Japan last year. I was on my own, just having breakfast, minding my own business. And someone came over to me and said, I don't know if you remember me, but I work for you, da 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 da. And I have to tell you that really made my week.
Doesn't it?
It does, and I assume if I'd been a complete idiot, he would have gone, okay, walk the other way. So I can't have been all bad as a boss. So, but just that filled me with such pleasure that we had established a relationship, we'd done something together, we worked together, and he was keen to remember that, and that's a nice feeling.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me, as I was describing the hospitality industry, that I even spent some time back in the kitchen. And it was during a time they were having a real hiring problem, in other words, bringing cooks in to do the job. And I went to the manager and I said, how would you like to not have that problem anymore? And she says, really? Well, what do you mean? I said, well, this dishwasher back here, he's pretty ambitious, and I think he wants to do more than wash dishes. And most of the time, these were Hispanic people that worked back in the kitchen. And I said, what you could do is you can promote him, into the kitchen, and you can start teaching him this skill, and now you've got somebody who does both positions. And she says, well, I'd love to do that with this guy, but the problem is that he's really good in the position as a graveyard worker, doing the job. And I said, well, that's fine. I can see you're thinking there, but this is also somebody who's becoming very frustrated because he's hearing that opportunity might be available when the time comes, but he's not seeing any action whatsoever. And you're going to end up losing him anyway. So I said, but if we were able to resolve that problem, what would that be worth? And she says, well, how would we do that? So I pulled him into the office and I said, do you know somebody who needs a job that you would recommend for doing your job? And he says, well, yeah. And I said, how soon can you get this person here? And he says, within a day or two. So if you bring this person in, then you should be able to have the time to come back into the kitchen and begin to learn a whole new skill, okay? And she couldn't believe it was that simple, but it really was. And sure enough, there was nothing more rewarding than coming in, of course, seeing all the other cooks who were just bending over backwards to train this guy, the same people that promised him that he was going to be there in the first place. But he had this big smile, on his face, the spatula in his hand, and I think it was about 2 or 3 years after that, just like you, I ran into him, and he always attributed his opportunity to what I did. I said, no, it was something you wanted to do. I just tried to find a way to help you get there. But it's important to help people get to where they want to go, even if it means there's a possibility they may get promoted over you.
Yeah, and I think you have to have enough faith and trust and belief in yourself that doing the right thing by people will always return more than not. I think the other side of the conversation, though, which is interesting, is, in a work environment, what you want to make sure you do is not get yourself in a position, in a role or a job where the company around you says, I don't know, we can afford to move that person. And I think that's part of why, planning a career and thinking through some milestones and some steps is so important. You don't want to be doing something for 5 years and go to your boss and say, I want to do something else. And they go, I don't know, we can afford you to lose you, so I'm afraid you need to do it for another year. And that's where a bit of planning and a bit of management comes in as well.
No doubt about that. And I think, as we touched on briefly, but it's something I found important, and I wished I had engaged in one more, and that's having a mentor.
Yeah, so I don't know anyone who's been really successful who doesn't at some point say, I have a mentor, I had mentors. And I think it's the thing that I know has made my career possible, and which is one of the reasons why I created the website, The 3-Minute Mentor, and now this book, was my desire to pass it on to a generation who I think is not getting as much help from mentors, is not getting some of the same feedback and training that I got as a new employee.
Now, for our listeners out there, you have a very unique website that could be very helpful in this. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's called The 3-Minute Mentor, so THE3MinuteMentor.com. And so over the years, we've been putting up sort of 3-minute mentoring videos, many of them absolutely discussing the things that you and I have been discussing. And there's 120 plus of them up there. One video goes up every couple of weeks, which are just simple mentoring advice and guidance that, how to influence someone, how should you think about diversity, all these sorts of questions that as a leader and as a growing manager you want advice on. They're up there, and it's the 3minutementor.com. You can get those videos.
Well, very good. Well, Nigel, it's certainly been a pleasure to have you here on the program. Your book, Become a 21st Century Executive, Breaking Away from the Pack. Certainly a valuable resource for people to know how they can do that very thing. And we want to thank you for being on the program. And for our listeners, what is that website again?
It's the 3minutementor.com.
Very good. Nigel, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Now you know how to break ahead of the pack. The next step to do is to take action. Another action you can take is visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. And become a newsletter subscriber. It's absolutely free. You can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond 50 Radio and also on Facebook as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program. And remember, live your day past